to all our listeners. Welcome to Abby and Donna Space. And before we start, let me ask, how are you guys? And what do you feel right now, our dear listeners?
I hope all of us will feel better soon. How about you, partner? How are you?
Same old, I'm tired and such, but I'm okay. It's just stressful because we often spend time in social media, partner, and because of that, we are exposed to arguments and issues that are being raised.
True, partner, and what's worse is that only a few falls on being a valid argument, and most of the time, arguments are full of fallacies, right, our dear listeners?
And speaking of fallacies, I heard from our friend that there had been an argument in their family about euthanasia. It is said to be full of well-known fallacies, partner, and our dear listeners.
Yeah, I heard that also, and I think that is why we're here in this space. We need to know these fallacies so that we can create valid arguments.
I agree, partner. So for us or the listeners to know these fallacies, just keep on listening because we're going to discuss the fallacies, counterfeit arguments. Let us use the euthanasia discussion our friend has told us, partner. So guys, suppose you are in a group discussion engaged in a serious and heated debate about the merits or demerits of euthanasia or mercy killing with your family members. The patient concerned is your uncle on your father's side, and his name is Uncle Fred. He has been in coma for almost 5 months, and because of your compassion for your uncle, you propose euthanasia by giving the following reasons. He's not in control of his faculties. It is certain that he is terminal. He is suffering and is in terrible pain. There's no medical option to relieve his suffering, and he's being kept alive by artificial means or the life support system. You concluded it is best if the life support system is removed so that the nature can take its course and allow your uncle to die with dignity. For you, this is the humane and the kind thing to do.
Hello everyone, I just want to say something about Uncle Fred. Uncle Fred is suffering and is in terrible pain. Don't you think that it is better if we just let him go? Like, he will undergo mercy killing. Besides, it is certain that he's terminal and is not in control of his faculties. There's no known medical options to relieve his suffering and only being kept alive by artificial means, this life support system.
I understand why you are proposing to murder your Uncle Fred. You have never been close to him. You are closer to your other uncles, especially on your mother's side. Now I know you hate your Uncle Fred. You have an evil mind and a heart of a stone. Based on the argument given by Aunt Marites, she committed the fallacy of argumentum ad hominem, or argument directed to the person. She picked up an argument with an acceptable conclusion and she feels compelled to attack the source of the argument. The ad hominem fallacy occurs when you dismiss an argument by attacking the person who made it, either by pointing out the character's fault or by implying ill motives to undermine credibility. That's why, dear listeners, let us remember that an argument must stand or fall on its own ground regardless of who made it.
If you insist in this line of reasoning, I will disinherit you, throw you out of the house, stop your schooling, and not talk to you ever again. You are putting me in a bad light with my brothers and sisters by suggesting that your Uncle Fred be murdered. What do you think your father has committed? Right! It is the argumentum ad baculum. It is the argument that appeals to the use of force. As you can see and hear earlier, he used intimidation, strong-arm tactics, and threat to deny your argument. But seriously though, disinheriting you does not demonstrate that your argument is weak. So remember that when threats and strong-arm techniques are used to force you to reject your own argument, it falls under the argumentum ad baculum.
What happened to you, my son? Don't you have any compassion for your uncle? Think of his 6 children. What will happen to them without their father? Is there no pity in your heart? Life is the most precious possession of a human being. So as long as a person is alive, there is a chance that he might live. A miracle might happen. Are you depriving your uncle of this chance? Hearing your mother talk that way, we can say that she committed the fallacy argumentum ad misericordiam, or appeal to pity. Ad misericordiam is a fallacy that occurs when your argument is invalidated by an appeal to the conclusion's emotional and miserable outcomes. Unfortunately, an appeal to pity will not reveal the flaws in your argument.
Son, there is always hope.
You are big and intelligent enough to know that nobody has succeeded in disproving the existence of miracles. So therefore, miracles exist. You should not deny your Uncle Fred his miracle of life.
Or dear listeners, what fallacy do you think your Uncle Bogart has committed? Absolutely correct. This fallacy falls under the fallacy called argumentum ad ignorantiam, or we can simply say the argument from ignorance. Just because nobody has denied the existence or presence of miracles in this world, it does not mean that there are. And if they wish to establish that miracles exist, the burden of proof is on them, not on you, dear listeners. So please remember, argumentum ad ignorantiam is when you infer the certainty or the truth of the conclusion because it cannot be disproved.
Can you imagine what will happen if follow as you suggested? Remove the life support system and let your Uncle Fred die? Son, we are Catholics. We value human lives more than any material things in the world. Are you suggesting that we abandon this time-honored traditional value and murder your Uncle Fred?
Have you heard Aunt Karen's argument here? She just committed the fallacy, argumentum ad populum, or appeal to popularity and traditional institution. You commit the ad populum fallacy when you rely the validity of an argument on the popularity of the conclusion. So listeners, make sure not to make conclusion that is only appealing because of popularity alone.
Right! If we remove the life support system, do you think the Catholic Church will allow such a cruel decision? Surely not! The Church believes in miracles. The Church will tell you that a medical breakthrough can happen anytime that will cure your uncle. Let us continue hoping and have faith in the Church.
Now, our dear listeners, your uncle just committed the fallacy called argumentum ad verecundiam. Argumentum ad verecundiam is the fallacy that appeals to the wrong authority. Why do we need to classify or why do we need to emphasize the wrong authority? It is because not all appeal to authority is fallacious, especially when it is supported by original facts and data and not simply from a testimony. Now, the Church cannot say whether or not a medical breakthrough is on the way that will spare your Uncle Fred from death. And again, we call this fallacy as argumentum ad verecundiam, the fallacy that appeals to the wrong authority.
Your attempt to justify removing the life support system of your Uncle Fred is horrifying. You devalue human life. You looked at your Uncle Fred like a horse who broke a leg, and since the horse is now useless, he deserves to die. May I suggest that the person we are talking about is a human being with intrinsic worth, and not a horse who has served his usefulness. Isn't Mother getting a little desperate here? The strawman fallacy is demonstrated in her argument. It is easier to deal with a strawman than it is to deal with a real person. So you commit the strawman fallacy when you intentionally mislead an argument in order to undermine it. You make a strawman and pass it off as the real argument. If we recall Mother's argument, the subject had now shifted to the intrinsic value of human life. It goes without saying that the weak substitute, the strawman, is easy to criticize. Simply said, the strawman fallacy occurs when you intentionally twist an argument in order to undermine it and then present it as the true argument. And listeners, Mother committed two more fallacies here, perhaps out of desperation. After the focus of the argument was switched to the strawman, the value of human life and the initial argument in favor of euthanasia was overlooked. Another fallacy known as the Red Herring Fallacy was committed. And if it is shifted to the analogy of a horse with a broken leg and the case of your Uncle Fred, this is another fallacy called false analogy. To easily understand, the Red Herring Fallacy occurs when the strawman substitute becomes the primary focus and the participants lose sight of the original argument. False analogy is a fallacy that occurs when you are given an analogy that is not accurate and a conclusion is drawn as if the analogy is valid.
How can you even make such a proposal? If you allow it to do it to your Uncle Fred, you will do it also to me, to your mother, to all your relatives and friends. Where will it stop? Are we going to kill everybody who outlive his or her usefulness? The mentally ill, the aged, the crippled and infirm? What about fatally deformed infants? Are you going to deprive them all of their right to life? I hope you see now how wrong your proposal is.
Now, Notice how your father commits the fallacy called the slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope fallacy is the fallacy when the conclusion of your argument is denied by indicating a series of consequences leading to an unfavorable outcome. Notice how your father's argument implies that if one case of mercy killing is allowed, it must therefore be allowed in other cases. You are urged not to take the first step, which is euthanasia, because you do not desire the outcome of giving mercy killing or euthanasia to terminally ill, the aged, the crippled, deformed infants, and the infirm. However, no indication taking or making the first step will result in all of the projected consequences leading to the terrible end.
Who among your relatives are contemplating to kill next?
Have you noticed the shaking in the voice of Uncle Fred's wife? Her argument is, however, troubling, and do you know why? She just committed the fallacy known as the complex question. Since you propose euthanasia to your Uncle Fred, the question implies the truth of a hidden conclusion that you are considering doing the same to your other relatives in a similar predicament. So, when you are asked a question that smuggles the truth of a conclusion, the fallacy is called a complex question.
Removing the life support of your Uncle Fred is wrong because it is wrong to take the life of another human being, even if the motive is to alleviate pain and suffering. Only God has that right.
What fallacy do you think your Uncle Hipólito has committed? Yes, it is the petitio principii, or the fallacy of begging the question. If your Uncle Hipólito claims that euthanasia is wrong, he must present evidence to support his claim. Know that you can't use the conclusion's claim as your premise to support your claim. It will not strengthen the argument. Yet it is said that many people believe that repeating the conclusion multiple times constitutes a sound argument. Circular reasoning of this kind is considered to be common. So, our dear listeners, petitio principii is when you make an argument by using the conclusion of the argument as evidences.
Either you do not value human life or you do not love your Uncle Fred. It seems to us that you do not love your Uncle Fred. Therefore, you do not value human life. Oh, mother, she has done it again. She doesn't want to stop just yet, does she? She committed another fallacy, this time the false dilemma fallacy. Because the argument is valid, it is quite convincing. However, the imposed dilemma is false. Other alternatives include your deep empathy for anyone who is suffering and has no hope of surviving the situation. Simply said, the false dilemma fallacy occurs when you are presented with an argument that forces you to accept only two options when there are others.
I think he likes pizza.
Our dear listeners, we've reached the final fallacy given. So, what do you think is the fallacy your brother has committed? Definitely, it is a non sequitur. Non sequitur in Latin means it does not follow. What your brother replied does not align or follow the premise set. If you notice, all the fallacious arguments share one thing in common. The conclusion does not follow from the premise set. That the premise set presented does not support the conclusion's claim. It is said that the blanket term non sequitur was coined to describe this. Because of that, it is said that if you've discovered a fallacy but can't remember what it's called, just call it non sequitur.
Now, let us move on to Module 6, Theories of Appraisal for Simple Arguments. Since we are talking about arguments, we must learn to compose a sound argument, but to do that, we have to fully understand first the particular types of arguments. Well, today, we will be discussing the types of arguments, the strength of each argument, and techniques of appraisals. Are you ready, dear listeners? Let's start with the empirical argument. How does a critical thinker assess an argument? A critical thinker must either criticize or evaluate an argument to appraise it. When a critical thinker criticizes an argument, his or her main concern is to show the weakness but also the strength of the argument to improve the argument. Since we have studied the different fallacies that can be committed in an argument, we must already know that demonstrating an argument that rests on fallacies demonstrates the weakness of an argument. However, pointing out the weakness of an argument is not enough to appraise it. We have to look for the strength of the arguments. Whether we are criticizing or evaluating an argument, we should develop the skill of estimating the strength of an argument. For the past meetings, we have heard quite a lot about the term empirical. And today, we will be discussing the empirical argument, and we will start on knowing where the strength of the argument rests. When you use an empirical generalization as the main premise in your argument and conclude, this argument is an empirical argument. This is one of the simplest and most typical types of arguments, although it should be noted that this style of argument does not always consist of a neat structure. So what does empirical argument look like? The basic premise of an empirical argument is an empirical generalization with a percentage estimate. To understand, let's have a look at one of the examples of an empirical argument. So dear listeners, here's our example. Here we have the generalization, exactly 80% of UP students are Catholics. And we have the premise, Peter, Paul, Mary are UP students. And we have the conclusion, therefore, more likely than not, with 80% probability, Peter, Paul, and Mary are Catholics. When we have discovered a good generalization, we can extend our generalization to cases that we have not observed by composing an argument. Using this pattern in our example, we can make an argument. Since Peter, Paul, Mary are UP students, and since exactly 80% of UP students are Catholics, therefore, more likely than not, Peter, Paul, and Mary are Catholics. The strength of this argument rests on the reliability of the main premise. We use the three tests we discussed before to evaluate the degree of confidence we can assign to the generalization. Since we are talking about degree, we should notice that the strength of empirical arguments is a matter of degree. So when composing an argument, a critical thinker will make use of the indicators. What are these indicators? First is the conclusion indicators that are used to stress the conclusion. Let us remember the following conclusion indicators. Therefore, hence, consequently, accordingly, so, thus, then, implies, and it follows. And the other one is the premise indicators that are used to mark the premise. Let us remember the following premise indicators: because, since, for, in view of the fact, and as much as, and as shown by. Once again, the strength of empirical arguments is a matter of degree, unless we have complete evidence to completely verify the truth of the conclusion. And when we execute our duty as critical thinkers, we must show that the evidence presented in favor of the generalization is incomplete or that the generalization failed to pass the three tests. Now listeners, let us consider another type of empirical argument, which is the inductive argument. Now is the time to put the technique for determining the strength of this form of argument into practice. To demonstrate the techniques, let us look at an example. Here's our example. These are the following premises. First, Maria is a UP freshman batch 1998 and comes from a poor family. Second, Anna is also a UP freshman batch 1998 and comes from a poor family. Third, Pepe is also a UP freshman batch 1998 and comes from a poor family. Fourth, all UP freshmen batch 1998 that I am acquainted with come from poor families, and there is no conflicting case. Fifth, therefore, most UP freshmen batch 1998 come from poor families. To appraise this argument, we have to look at and observe the conclusion and the premises. The conclusion uses the indicator most, and the required evidence to establish a most claim is 50% plus 1. Now, let us look at the premises. Would the evidence offered in the premises make the conclusion more likely than its opposite? That is to say, would the premises support the opposite claim, which is most UP freshmen batch 1998 do not come from poor families? I don't think so. So now, instead of claiming most, we can change our claim to many to make the argument strong. In conclusion, the best technique for challenging an empirical argument is to demonstrate that the required evidence for the level of generalization asserted has not been met, or the three tests for good generalization were not followed.
Now, our dear listeners, let us tackle the nature of an analytic argument. Here, it is said to have a similar simple structure to the previous argument, the empirical argument. However, an analytic argument's main premise is an analytic statement, not an empirical generalization. And because analytic statements are often the definition or a well-formed formula, WFF, of some formal system, it follows the principle of excluded middle. And the excluded middle, it means that the statements are only either true or false. You see, because analytic statements' truth values are non-empirical, we could conclude that the distinction between analytic and empirical arguments lies in their content. Let us use the given example to better understand the analytic argument. Notice that the analytic argument begins with an analytic statement as the main premise. The main premise is a formal definition or well-formed formula WFF of empirical science. The minor premise is an instantiation of the definition or the WFF. Our dear listeners, you will notice that the premises support the validity or truth of the conclusion if the definition and minor premises are both uncontroversial and accurate or true. In contrast to empirical arguments, the additional evidence does not significantly strengthen analytic arguments. Our dear listeners, please keep in mind that this is the only type of argument in which the strength does not accept or admit any degrees, and the conclusion is either instantiation of the well-formed formula WFF or it is not. As a result, it is either very good or very bad. It neither has degrees nor middle grounds. And lastly, the available technique for you, our dear listeners, to challenge an analytic argument is to demonstrate the truth of the main premise is controversial or show or prove that the minor premise is not an instantiation of the major premise.
Before diving into our next type of argument, let us recall some points about argument. Any oral or written discourse in which some claims are used as a reason, justification, or evidence to support the claim of another statement is called an argument. The statement's assertion could be true, false, or probable, good or bad, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable. The premise is the part of the discourse that is used to support the claim, and the conclusion is part of the discourse that is supported by the premises. So now, dear listeners, what we are going to discuss now is the evaluative argument. The structure of many simple evaluative arguments is similar to that of empirical and analytical arguments. The primary distinction is the nature of the conclusion's claim, which can be good or evil, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable, moral or immoral, and not true or false. The major premise of an evaluative argument is neither a generalization nor an analytic definition, but it is a moral rule or a moral principle. Take note, dear listeners, that an evaluative argument's premise does not have to be true or false, and the premises of the argument can be empirical or analytical. Also, because the appeal lies in the strength of public acceptance or intersubjective of the intended audience, estimating the power of an evaluative argument is more challenging. As a result, a critical thinker must develop the ability to assess how arguments support a good, right, or correct claim. Let us consider this example of an evaluative argument. And here, in the example, we have the moral principle, never punish an innocent person. The premise, Pedro is accused of a crime but he is innocent. The conclusion, therefore, Pedro should not be punished. Please observe that the main premise is a statement of a moral principle and only the minor premise is an empirical statement, and the conclusion is a command in the form of a proscription. Commands are neither true nor false nor even probable. Commands have no truth value. Again, the strength of an evaluative argument rests on whether there is wide public acceptance or strong intersubjective supporting the main premise. So take note of this. Accepting the main premise as correct will drive us to accept the conclusion as correct as well if there is a significant intersubjective consensus supporting it. The truth condition has little impact on the premises or conclusion of an evaluative argument. The most important factor is audience acceptance. Now let's talk about the two types of evaluative argument. The first one appeals to the nature of the act itself. This argument pattern is called the deontological argument. An evaluative claim is good or right in a deontological argument if it follows a moral rule or principle. The claim's consequences are no longer relevant. So here's an example of a deontological argument. Here we have the moral principle, never break a promise. The premise, June promised to come to the party at 9 p.m. The conclusion, therefore June should come at 9 p.m. The strength of this argument depends on whether or not the moral rule never break a promise is widely accepted. However, in our society, we have a saying that promises are made to be broken. To justify breaking a promise, so this moral rule is occasionally broken without significant consequences. This means that the justification provided by the premises to the conclusion is only moderately strong. Let's move on now to another type of evaluative argument. This other type appeals to the consequences of the act, and this argument pattern is called the Leological Argument. Unlike the deontological argument, the teleological argument cannot assess if an evaluative statement is correct without examining the claim's consequences. In this case, an action is justified if it results in the desired outcomes. This type of argument starts with the definition of what is good. Once the definition is accepted, right action is defined as action that supports the good, while the wrong action is defined as any action that hinders the attainment of the good. Let us look at this example of the Leological argument. We have the definition, all actions in accordance with God's will are good. The premise, the 10 commandments are in accordance with God's will. Conclusion, thus, you ought to obey the 10 commandments. This argument includes an explicit definition of the term good in accordance with God's will, and any act that reaffirms God's will is right, while any action that hinders God's will is wrong. It appears obvious that if we accept the premises, we must also accept the conclusion. So, listeners, the best technique available to a critical thinker for criticizing an evaluative argument is to consider whether the moral principle has wider acceptance or broad intersubjective consensus, or that there is another moral rule that will neutralize the force of the argument's moral rule. On the other hand, a critical thinker must indicate that the projected consequences are unlikely to occur if the reasoning is teleological.
In conclusion, let us go over the techniques for determining the strength of an argument. When evaluating the strength of the argument, the first step is to be explicit on the conclusion's claim. What is the conclusion attempting to prove? Is the claim analytic, empirical, or evaluative? You will be able to determine whether the premises supplied to support the conclusion are relevant or irrelevant in this manner. To be sure, the premises established may be correct, but they do not establish what is wanted because the conclusion's claim is not connected with the truth of the premises. So the first step for judging argument strength is to identify the type of argument. If empirical argument, verify the claim of conclusion. If it is generalization, try to identify or determine if the evidence offered by the premises affirms the generalization. If it is analytic, verify if the terms employed are synchronized in premise and conclusion, and then decide if the conclusion is an instantiation of analytic definition or a well-formed formula. If evaluative, verify the claim of conclusion and then determine if the moral rule or principle has widespread public acceptability. If you are offered a premise that does not support the conclusion's claim, a fallacy known as the fallacy of irrelevant reason has been committed. So if the conclusion's claim is ambiguous, unclear, or vague, there's a great possibility of showing that the fallacy has been committed. The second step is to analyze the premises and accept that they are all true for the time being. And if all of them are true, think if the premise set would suffice to support the conclusion's claim. Would it give the conclusion solid or strong support, fairly moderate, solid, or strong support, or just a little support? After this, demonstrate that the premises have failed to offer the necessary evidence to establish the truth of the conclusion or its high probability, and then demonstrate that the support provided by the premises is extremely minimal or inconsequential.
After identifying the type of argument and examining the premises and temporarily granting them to be all true, what are we going to do next? The third step is to challenge the truth of the premises. To challenge the truth of the premises, at least one of the premises must be proven to be false. If this isn't possible, show that establishing the truth of one of the premises with confidence is extremely difficult. Remember that both an affirmative and a negative universal statement are challenging to verify. Still, they are simple to counterfeit, and a majority claim must offer evidence equal to 50% plus 1. Keep in mind that if one of the premises is false or cannot be claimed to be accurate, the entire premise set is wrong. A false premise set reveals nothing to the conclusion. We have already challenged the truth of the premises. Now, for the fourth and final step, we have to challenge the truth of the conclusion. We must utilize counterexample to show that the conclusion is false or implausible, as this is the quickest approach to undermine an argument. Giving a counterexample is a basic, quick, precise, and a very effective technique. So listeners, keep in mind that as critical thinkers, we should use these critical approaches every time we come across an argument. We've learned one of the most crucial skills of a philosopher in this module, and we've just become a strong debate opponent.
Our dear listeners, you were introduced to simple pattern of argument in the previous topic, which you're more likely to encounter in everyday conversation. This topic is also for you if you wish to learn how to better or compose more complex arguments, because the moment has come to discuss how to develop your ability to compose complex arguments. This discussion will attempt to provide a step-by-step explanation with accompanying examples to help you gain full confidence in utilizing the template for creating an argument, and will help you remove hazy areas in the template. So, let us use once again the example of our friend here. Suppose you are asked to compose an argument in support of the conclusion, most politicians are corrupt. If you can show that 50% plus 1 of the entire number of politicians here in the Philippines is proven to be corrupt, then you won't need to use the template. However, because we don't know how many politicians are here in the Philippines and the term corrupt is difficult to define, it's helpful to utilize that template. The process will be aided by the 6th step. So let us now see the first step. The first step is to examine the statement of the conclusion. In examining, first, you need to state your conclusion in simple language. Sort the types of concepts employed in the conclusion to facilitate the answers to the subsequent items. Here, you need to keep an eye out of the types of concepts in your conclusion. This will establish the momentum for the other template items. Because if you mistakenly classify them, probably you will make a mistake in your categorization of knowledge claim in your conclusion. For example, the key concept in your conclusion involves an evaluative concept. So, more likely, your conclusion's claim is evaluative. The same goes with analytic and empirical. Here, the conclusion is simple and not complicated in the case most politicians are corrupt. We already know that the most claim must be 50% plus 1. You will notice that the term most, politicians, and corrupt, these terms are empirical. Thus, the conclusion is an empirical generalization with loaded emotional words. Next, for you to have a common frame of reference, define the key terms in your conclusion using the analytic definition technique. Give particular attention to the terms that may be seen as unclear or vague or confusing or what we call ambiguous. Know that it will be difficult for us to acquire the necessary evidence to prove our claim if the unclear or vague terms in the conclusion remain undefined. So in this example, 3 terms must be defined: a politician, corrupt, and a most claim. And to define the domain of generalization, we must specify the domain of most claim by knowing the number of politicians and taking the required proof of 50% plus 1 to be called corrupt. Let us try to examine the 3. First, in the Philippine context, the term politician is vague and confusing or ambiguous. However, the usual definition of this word is someone who is running for, has previously run for, and won any elective position. However, there are several circumstantial boundaries when this phrase becomes unclear and confusing. What about people who lost in the election, for example? What about people who campaign for political leaders or those who are active members of political parties? Can we classify them as politicians too? Next, to avoid the disparaging implication, the term corrupt is best utilized in legal setting. A politician who has been found guilty of a crime and of course convicted in Disandigan Bayan is a corrupt politician. In the Philippines, an accused is presumed innocent unless proven guilty. However, this definition can be argued to be overly limited because what about the politicians who were not apprehended and convicted? Can they no longer be called corrupt? Lastly, if you don't know the numbers of politicians there are in the country, determining the coverage of the term most will be tough or difficult. In the current situation, it is difficult to estimate the number of politicians involved in the Philippine politics since it is said to have full, half, part-time and occasional politician in our country's politics. Letter C, consider things like, can there be agreement on the meaning or application of terms? Or is the description or definition of the term biased and controversial? When there is no agreement on the meaning of important terms in your conclusion, the argumentation will be verbal. The terms in our example conclusion that are extremely subjective to this are corrupt and politicians. There, dear listeners, you will observe that skills in classifying concepts, detecting unclear and ambiguous concepts, and using analytic definitions are essential or required in the very first step. And if you don't learn these abilities or skills, your attempt to learn how to compose an argument will most certainly fail. So, partner, what is our next step?
For our next step, partner, we have the analysis of the claim of the conclusion. First, we need to classify the conclusion into types of knowledge claims. We must determine whether the conclusion is analytic, empirical, or evaluative in the second step. Is it a legal or policy proposal if it's evaluative? Is the conclusion's claim debatable? We will make a mistake in attempting to determine the required evidence supporting the claim of our conclusion if we make a mistake in classifying the claim of our conclusion as more likely than not. So, we must classify the conclusion into types of knowledge claims. Next, we need to ask the following questions. What is the conclusion trying to prove? What is the required proof or evidence to justify the claim of the conclusion? In creating a complex argument, this is the most important step. We won't be able to compose the argument if we can't answer this question. So, let's break down the difficult skill into its specific components. First, if the conclusion is an empirical generalization, starting with some, many, most, almost all, and all, we have an ascending degree of generalization. We can challenge the required evidence to affirm the generalization's degree. As a result, this is applicable in our example. If we have the conclusion most politicians are corrupt, in which an empirical generalization with the most claim, then the requisite evidence is that 50% plus 1 of the populations of politicians be shown to be corrupt. Second, if the conclusion is an evaluative claim, we can rely on the strength of intersubjective consensus or public favor to support our assertion. Third, if it is a legal or policy proposal, we can argue the beneficial consequences if the conclusion is a legal or policy proposal. This is the most effective technique to defend a legal or policy proposal. Finally, we must assess whether the conclusion's claim is within the known, knowable, or unknowable realm. It is provable if the assertion is within the range of the known and knowable. If a claim is unknowable, it cannot be proven. If the claim can be proven, try to figure out whether the evidence can be generated in fact or only in principle.
Thank you for that, partner. So for the third step, you will compose the argument. At this point, it is expected that you are prepared to present at least 3 but no more than 5 premises that would provide the most solid support for your conclusion's claim. Our dear listeners, note that writing or composing an argument is one of the most creative or finest things, as said, that you can do in philosophy. So here are the given premise set examples for our conclusion: most politicians are corrupt. So number 1, politicians are obsessed with one objective in mind: to win an election and stay in power. All obstacles to this goal must be eliminated either by illegal or legal means. Number 2, politicians will bribe to get adherents, will buy votes, will terrorize their enemies and even the voters, and sometimes will murder their political enemy. Next, politicians will actively solicit campaign funds from any source, from legitimate business to drug lords and gambling lords. And once elected, they are duly bound to protect the interests of their patrons, even at the expense of national interest. Lastly, number 4, high moral values and principles do not motivate politicians. That is why there are no permanent alliances here in the Philippine politics. In the name of perpetuating themselves in power, all moral values and principles are subordinated to the goal of winning an election. So, after presenting these premises, what should we do now, partner?
Here's what we are going to do next, partner. For the fourth step, we need to criticize the argument. Remember that while criticizing any argument, whether our own or not, our basic tactic is to break or at the very least weaken the premise support for the conclusion. To do that, we need to scrutinize the conclusion first. How can we do that? Let's use our example conclusion. Most politicians are corrupt. Let's take a closer look at this conclusion. First, by re-examining how the conclusion was stated. There is no need to alter the conclusion statement in our case. However, the terms politician and corrupt need to be clarified. Then, the conclusion's assertion must then be re-examined. Because our example is an empirical generalization, we must require 50% plus 1 as evidence. But this conclusion has no facts at all to support the number of corrupt politicians in the Philippines. Hence, this argument committed the fallacy of hasty generalization. So the fastest approach to refute an empirical argument is to confront the conclusion and show that it is false or at the very least improbable by providing a counterexample. Unfortunately, because the generalization is not an all claim, it is not susceptible to a counterexample according to our conclusion. Next is to scrutinize the premise set. There are a lot of things needed to consider in scrutinizing the premise set, but for now, I will only discuss with you, dear listeners, the points that are applicable in our example. The first step is to categorize our premises into different types of knowledge claims. The premises in our example are making an empirical generalization about politicians who use emotion-driven words. The next step is to create a basic assessment of the argument strength by evaluating the strength of each premise support. If we suppose that all of the empirical premises in our example are true, the premise set support is fairly strong. Unfortunately, proving the premises to be true would be quite difficult. However, the argument is powerful because the conclusion's claim is generally accepted, though without empirical evidence to back it up. Next, we must show that the premise set is insufficient to prove the conclusion's claim by asserting that the premise set is inadequate to prove what is required. The premise stated in our example is insufficient to prove the conclusion's claim. Then, we must try to figure out if a crucial premise is missing from the set. In our example, the number of politicians guilty of political or election-related offenses is not produced. We must now approach them by requesting the necessary evidence for each degree of generalization. The requisite evidence for generalization was not given in our example, which is 50% plus 1. But it appears that the premises are not irrelevant because they provide highly convincing support for the conclusion's assertion. Ultimately, we are not prepared to show that the premises fail to establish or justify the conclusion's claim by questioning the premises one by one, starting with the one that provided the most support.
Yan, after completing the previous step, you should be prepared to defend the opposite of your original conclusion by providing at least 3 but no more than 5 premises that could support the claim of the opposing conclusion. So here are the given counter-arguments. Number 1, it is unfair to claim that most politicians are corrupt on the evidence of newspaper reports and other mass media claim that most politicians are corrupt for the simple reason that only few politicians were charged and convicted in court. Second one, we are condemning most politicians on the basis of bad publicity image created by mass media in sensationalizing the election or political crimes rather than the good deeds of the most politicians. For the next counter-arguments, number 3, while I admit that the main objective of politicians is to win the elective post aspired for, it seems to be absurd to claim that most will use illegitimate means to get elected, like buy votes, terrorize their political enemies, and accept campaign donation from drug lords and gambling lords. Lastly, number 4, it cannot be true that most politicians, that is 50% plus, are not motivated by high moral values and principles. There simply is no evidence supporting the truth of this premise.
We are down now to the last step. The sixth step is to evaluate both arguments. As critical thinkers, we must determine which of our arguments, the original or the counter-argument, is stronger. Which argument is the most convincing? Is it possible to improve the weaker argument by adding, changing, or modifying the premises? This is the second part of our training to help us develop our metacognitive skills faster. Consider assessing the persuasiveness of our initial argument and counter-argument. As a result, the two arguments failed to establish their conclusions and are therefore unclear. Both have the same flaw, a lack of empirical data to support the empirical generalization most. The original argument is more appealing and likely to be accepted as truth since public perception equals reality in Philippine politics. The premises presented to justify the conclusion claim most politicians are corrupt are guilty of serious errors with no actual proof to back up their numerous generalizations. Furthermore, the most relevant information it could provide, such as the percentage of politicians convicted of political or election-related offenses, was missing. This is the most essential piece of evidence that can be presented to support the conclusion's assertion. If this evidence is presented, the argument will be significantly strengthened. The counterpoint produced premises that directly contradicted the original argument's premises. An essential piece of empirical evidence missing from the argument is proof that most politicians are not corrupt.
And that is all for today, our dear listeners. Thank you for listening to our today's discussion. I hope you learned something from us, and of course, thank you also to our friend, Sir Acuña, for the content, basically all the ideas and examples given. And ayan, lastly, if you have any questions, kindly reply to the thread pinned on our account. Thank you very much. We will end the space now.